History remembers Rome as the height of civilization, marble temples, law, architecture, empire. But beneath the polished stone and the rhetoric of virtue, there was another Rome, a Rome that worshipped power through cruelty, that saw blood as divine currency and pleasure as politics. A Rome that believed the gods demanded more than prayers. They demanded flesh. From its founding myths to its imperial glory, Rome was a civilization built on ritual. And those rituals were not for the faint of heart. They were not symbolic gestures of faith. They were transactions, offerings of life, blood, and suffering in exchange for victory, fertility, and control. To understand Rome's power, you have to understand its hidden rituals, the ones that mixed religion with death, love with ownership, and entertainment with execution. Because in the Roman world, everything sacred was soaked in sin. The story begins not in marble halls, but in mud and blood. According to legend, Rome's founder, Romulus, built his city after murdering his twin brother. A fratricide so violent, it became the seed of Rome's destiny. From the very start, Roman religion was not about forgiveness. It was about dominance. Every act of faith reinforced power. Every ritual fed the state. The Romans didn't pray for mercy. They prayed for victory, and to them, victory required sacrifice. Even before Rome became an empire, its earliest rituals were soaked in blood. During the festival of the Lupercalia, naked men ran through the streets, whipping women with strips of goat hide to ensure fertility. The crowds laughed, the women stood willingly in their path, and the priests declared it holy. It was chaos, disguised as faith. The boundaries between religion and desire, between piety and perversion, blurred completely. To the Romans, the human body wasn't sacred. It was a tool, something to be used, tested, and displayed for the gods and the state alike. When wars began to define the Republic, so did blood offerings. Before each campaign, Roman generals performed elaborate rituals, sacrificing bulls, rams, and even prisoners of war. The augurs, Rome's sacred diviners, slit open the victims' chests, reading omens in the shape of their livers, a dark science of superstition. The army didn't march until the entrails promised success, and if the signs were unclear, they tried again, with fresh bodies. For the Romans, death wasn't tragedy. It was policy. As Rome expanded, so did its appetite. For territory, for slaves, for spectacle. The rituals that once belonged to the temples now spilled into the streets and the arenas. The gladiatorial games weren't just entertainment, they were religious ceremonies dressed in armor. Each death in the arena was an offering, every drop of blood a libation to the gods of victory. The crowds might have cheered for sport, but the state sanctified the slaughter. The games began as funeral rites, meant to honor the dead through combat. But over time, they became the empire's favorite form of worship. The Colosseum itself was a temple to death. Its architects designed it not for beauty, but for ritual precision. Beneath the sand lay a network of tunnels, cages, and mechanisms built to release beasts and men in perfect sequence. Each show was a liturgy of violence, choreographed and approved by priests of spectacle. On festival days, the air reeked of sweat and iron. Trumpets blared. Slaves led condemned men through the gates. Some begged for mercy. Most were silent. They knew the arena was not a place of chance. It was an altar. And the emperor sat at its center, a living god judging who would die and who would live. Mercy, when granted, was not compassion. It was theater. Every thumb up, every gesture of pardon reminded the people that their ruler held the power of life itself. To Rome, that was the highest ritual, the worship of authority. But blood alone wasn't enough. Rome demanded loyalty not only from its subjects, but from their bodies. Love, sex, marriage, all were tools of control. The Romans claimed to revere family, yet the state dictated its terms. Marriage was a contract of politics, not affection. Wealthy men chose wives like alliances, measuring lineage and fertility above all. A woman's worth was written in her womb, her virtue, her obedience, and her usefulness to the state. At dawn, Roman brides were led to their husbands' homes, veiled in flame-colored cloth, their hair bound in sacred knots to symbolize submission. The ceremony ended not with love, but with command. The moment the bride was carried over the threshold, a reminder that she entered not by choice, but by conquest. Even the gods mirrored this cruelty. Jupiter, king of the gods, was worshipped for his dominion, not his mercy. His myths were filled with abduction, seduction, and punishment. Roman religion didn't hide human vice, it sanctified it. Behind closed doors, the city's elite hosted feasts of excess that blended devotion and debauchery. The cult of Bacchus, god of wine and ecstasy, became infamous for its secret rites. Witnesses described torchlit gatherings where worshippers danced, drank, and surrendered to frenzy. Ritual orgies said to dissolve social order and awaken the divine through pleasure. To the Senate, it was rebellion disguised as religion. They banned the Bacchanalia, calling it a threat to Rome itself. But privately, many senators still attended, because power in Rome wasn't about morality, it was about control over others and over desire. If stories like this fascinate you, if you're drawn to the places where civilization hides its cruelty behind marble and myth, then stay with us. Because what came next in Rome's secret history was darker than anything that came before. The empire's rise didn't purify its rituals, it perfected them. Under the emperors, religion became propaganda, and ritual became surveillance. Every sacrifice, every festival, every whisper of faith served one purpose: to remind the people who ruled them. When Augustus declared himself the son of a god, he reshaped religion into obedience. Temples once dedicated to Jupiter and Mars now bore his image. His victories were celebrated in processions that looked like worship. His name became prayer. But behind the pomp, Rome's darker traditions continued. The Vestal Virgins, 6 women chosen as keepers of the sacred flame, were symbols of purity and divine favor. They lived in luxury, yet under terror. A single act of desire, a single rumor of impurity, was punished by death. They weren't executed by sword or fire, they were buried alive, entombed beneath the city they served, left with a lamp, a loaf of bread, and the slow suffocation of silence. The priests called it justice, Rome called it piety. The irony was cruel. A society that glorified conquest and excess demanded absolute chastity from its holy women. The same people who filled arenas with carnage demanded purity from their priestesses. This was Rome's contradiction, a civilization that worshipped order but thrived on blood. As the empire grew, so did its thirst for divine reassurance. Whenever disaster struck, plague, famine, rebellion, the priests sought scapegoats. Foreigners, slaves, Christians, anyone who could be accused of angering the gods. During Nero's reign, the city burned. The flames devoured entire districts. The people demanded an answer, and Nero gave them one: blame the Christians. In the name of ritual purification, he unleashed a slaughter. Men and women were crucified, torn apart by dogs, or burned alive as human torches to illuminate his gardens. The emperor watched from his balcony, calling it justice for the gods. Rome had perfected the art of public sacrifice. Every execution was a ceremony, every victim a warning. And yet through it all, the empire told itself it was civilized, that these acts preserved order, that cruelty was duty, because in Rome, morality was measured in service to power. Even pleasure was politicized. In the imperial palaces, desire became a currency of control. Emperors like Caligula and Commodus turned the rituals of the gods into spectacles of their own madness. Caligula declared himself divine, forcing senators to kneel before him, ordering the moon to be brought down from the sky, and turning the temple of Jupiter into his private stage. He didn't just worship power, he performed it. Banquets dissolved into cruelty, guests humiliated, lovers executed on whims. To defy the emperor's pleasure was to defy the gods themselves. Commodus went further. He stepped into the arena, dressed as Hercules reborn, fighting slaves disguised as gladiators. Every blow, every kill, was choreographed ritual, a fusion of politics, theater, and insanity. When the emperor bled, the empire watched in reverence. Because Rome's faith had become spectacle, the empire's gods were no longer divine. They were reflections of its ruler's vanity. But beneath the marble and fire, something else was happening. Rome's people were losing faith, not just in their gods, but in their rituals. The old sacrifices no longer brought victory. The wars grew longer, the coffers emptier. The temples still burned incense, but the empire's soul was turning to ash. The more Rome tried to control its citizens through ritual, the less control it actually had. People turned to new cults. Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, and eventually, Christianity. Each promised redemption without blood, mercy without spectacle. For the first time, Rome's monopoly on faith was challenged, and the state responded the only way it knew how, with violence. The persecutions intensified, secret rites were raided, priests executed, converts burned, but repression couldn't kill an idea. It only sanctified it. The same empire that had built its power on ritual sacrifice was undone by a religion that condemned it. By the 4th century, the unthinkable happened. Rome converted. The Emperor Constantine raised the cross over the same city that had once crucified its followers. The temples were closed, the sacrifices outlawed. But old habits die hard. The rituals didn't vanish. They changed their names. The incense still burned, the priests still ruled, the crowd still gathered. Only the gods were different. Rome hadn't abandoned its love of spectacle or its hunger for power. It had simply baptized them. The blood that once fed Jupiter now fed empire through crusade, conquest, and holy war. The rituals lived on. In the end, Rome's story is not just one of empire and conquest. It's a story of how belief can become bondage, how ritual, meant to bind humans to gods, can instead chain them to power. Every sacrifice, every ceremony, every whispered prayer reinforced a single truth. In Rome, to exist was to serve. The gladiator, the vestal, the emperor, they were all performers in the same theater of control. When we look at the ruins today, the Colosseum, the temples, the altars, we see beauty. But the stones remember screams. Every marble column once cast a shadow over a body offered to gods that no longer listen. Rome's glory was built not on enlightenment, but on obedience. Its faith was never about love, it was about fear. If you've made it this far, if you still believe history's light can reveal its darkest corners, subscribe to Tortured Past. Because the rituals of Rome are not ancient echoes, they're reminders that every empire, no matter how civilized it appears, hides its own altars, and every society that worships power eventually becomes its sacrifice. Rome's blood has dried, but its lesson remains. Civilization is never clean. Behind every temple stands a shadow, and behind every god, a grave.